The first time I ever saw a $100 bill, I was 5 years old. I was at my best friend Amy's house, and we had just asked her dad for $1 so we could walk up to Mr. Barbie's store and get some candy. And Buzzy pulled out his money clip with a wad of bills. As he searched through to get to the $1 bills, I saw 3 $100 bills and 2 50s. Amy and I looked at each other wide-eyed, just trying to imagine how much candy we could buy with that $100 bill. Now see, Buzzy is someone who really enjoyed his money. He grew up in a family business. He wore elegant and colorful clothes. He always drove a late model Cadillac. My favorite of his was light blue with white leather seats. And he bought a new one every couple years. My family, my dad wore light blue or white Oxford shirts, navy or gray slacks, and cheap ties. And we would drive our cars until they literally fell apart on the side of the highway. There was always a lot of tension and anxiety in my house around money, but I noticed that the conversations and attitudes were different in Amy's house, and it would take me years before I really understood why. My grandfather went bankrupt and lost his drugstore in the late 1960s. When this happened, my grandmother, Mathilde, enrolled in secretarial school and for the first time in her life got a job outside the home as a church secretary at the age of 50. A year later, my grandfather died of a heart attack. You see, both my parents were the first in their families to graduate from high school and eventually college. My dad went on to medical school. Motivated in part by fear and a love of learning, he graduated second in his class at Duke Medical School. He went on to be a professor and work at Duke for over close to 50 years. My mother was also the daughter of a high school secretary and a carpenter who worked on the docks in New York City. But their collective sacrifice made it possible to attend Duke University's nursing school, where she met my father. Both my parents were born on the heels of the Great Depression. And so for that reason, and because of the struggles they had growing up, they lived with the narrative of scarcity in their lives. And they carried their narrative with them as they raised their family. I was the oldest of 4 children, and we grew up in Durham, North Carolina, a big university town where everybody lived well below their means. Even so, if your dad was a doctor or a dentist, you were considered rich. But the constant changing, this disconnect and incongruence between how we were seen and what I experienced in my family created a lot of curiosity and confusion. The conversation in my family sounded something like this: "We don't have enough money this month. Cash flow is tight. Money doesn't grow on trees, young lady. We can't afford that. It's too expensive." Sound familiar? My curiosity and confusion only grew when I went away to college. I was fortunate enough to attend a private liberal arts college in New England, where I encountered an entirely new set of unspoken rules about money. My classmates' parents were CEOs of major companies and investment banks. The international students who lived on my hall had grown up in palaces. For the first time, I had a lot less financial flexibility than most of my classmates. And yet, when graduation approached and we started interviewing for jobs, I watched as many of my classmates struggled. Most of them hadn't worked in the summers. They'd spent time in Cape Cod and the Hamptons. A few had worked for their father's company, but they didn't know what it meant to work a 40-hour week or to be chewed out by a supervisor. I'd spent the summers waiting tables and interning for 2 different trade associations. And these experiences gave me self-confidence, helped me learn how to express my ideas. I learned the importance of showing up early and staying late, how to accept criticism and feedback, and how to express my ideas. They didn't know what it meant to be coached or mentored. They didn't know what it meant to take risks. And they didn't have the opportunity to discover what they were really passionate about. And that's when I first realized that there could be disadvantages in growing up with great wealth or inheriting great wealth. I think this was really the beginning of my fascination with the wounds of wealth. The wounds of wealth are the way that money, or the pursuit of money, negatively impacts our sense of self, the choices we make, and how we see the world. Rich and poor, we all have them. Let's face it, none of us had a choice about the families we grew up in. We inherit these wounds of wealth from our families where we're born into or those we marry into, and we often unconsciously pass them along to our children. It is widely understood that those who grow up in poverty often face enormous barriers to success, whether that means graduating from high school, getting into or graduating from college, or simply finding a full-time job. What's less recognized in our culture is that growing up with or inheriting great wealth can also be a barrier to personal success and discovering a sense of meaning and purpose in your life. Jessie O'Neill was the great-granddaughter of Charles Wilson, who was the former president of General Motors. She grew up in a dysfunctionally affluent family and wrote a book about it. In her book, The Golden Ghetto, she recounts her struggle for personal sobriety and search for meaningful employment. Eventually, she became a psychologist who works with families who are facing challenges in raising their children in an environment of affluence. What I found most interesting was her research that clearly demonstrated that the children of the wealthy suffered from some of the same personality traits as those who grew up in poverty. These include the inability to delay gratification, tolerate frustration, often low self-confidence, low self-esteem, and a false sense of entitlement. Without treatment or intervention, these behaviors often continue into adulthood, and they show up in the children of the wealthy as with a higher than normal degree of substance abuse, low-level depression, apathy, difficulty forming and sustaining intimate relationships, as well as difficulty finding and keeping meaningful employment. As a fundraiser for more than 20 years, I have seen the wounds of wealth up close. Those wounds of wealth in donor families, as well as in the faculty, clergy, and nonprofit leaders with whom I worked. They are as equally pained by their wounds of wealth and enslaved by their scarcity mindset as the families who grew up with money. What I learned from these donors, however, was that those who were living the most beautiful and meaningful lives and were among the happiest believed that giving was the most important way that they could heal the wounds of wealth and discover a sense of meaning and purpose in their life. I watched many donors make their first $1 million gifts and had tears in their eyes as they thanked the university president for the opportunity to make a difference. It may seem counterintuitive in a way that giving away money makes us feel rich, but it does. You see, we're wired for this. We all crave a sense of connection and community. We all want to feel seen and to know that we make a difference. There were two times in my life where I was challenged to grapple with my own wounds of wealth and take a review and think about what money really meant to me. The first was when I was age 30 and had somewhat of a career meltdown. After college, I had moved to Washington, D.C. and enrolled in law school, got a job working full-time and went at night. It took me 4 years. And when I graduated, I got a job with a large real estate developer. It was a good job. I made good money and worked really long hours. I was doing all that was expected of me. And like most 20-somethings, I was consuming and acquiring. I shopped, drank a lot of wine, and socialized, all really in an effort to quash these feelings of restlessness. But the truth was, I felt dead inside. I was realizing that I wasn't motivated by money or stuff. I had this deep desire to make a difference in the world. And I realized I was just living out of alignment with my values. Joseph Campbell has written that every hero's journey begins with an act of defiance. So, I quit my job and spent the summer teaching horseback riding and cleaning stalls at a YMCA camp in South Carolina. At the end of the summer, I moved back to Durham, my hometown, and got a job waiting tables at night so I could job hunt during the day. I have to say, there's really no better way to let your parents know that you don't give a damn about money and status than to get a job waiting tables with your law degree. It took me 3 months, and I landed my first fundraising job with Habitat for Humanity. The work really spoke to my passion for bringing people together from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds together to make a difference. On the building site, we'd have conservative Christians working along, returning Peace Corps hippie types, blue collar, members of Habitat family getting their sweat equity hours in. I loved my job. My dad, not so much. My decision had really created a lot of tension between us. He was frustrated because after all he and my mother had invested in my education, here I had stepped off the fast track and taken a job in the nonprofit sector, making a fraction of my former salary. It was a tough time. And yet, with some outside help of a good therapist, we really learned to listen to one another. We learned that we shared the same values. And we both realized that we had the right to make our own choices. I had to realize that also if I was going to work in a nonprofit job, I couldn't go to my parents when I'd have an expensive car repair or wanted to take a trip. I had to live in integrity within my own means. We also learned that we had different meanings for money. For my dad, it meant security, understandably. For me, it was freedom. I was finally doing work that was meaningful to me. I felt a great deal of passion and purpose in my life, and I felt rich. The second time this happened was about 10 years ago when I moved to Charlotte, a city that is the second largest financial center in the country, and it was also settled by Scotch Presbyterians, known for their thrifty or stingy ways, depending on your perspective. Charlotte's a town where money matters. I got married a lawyer, dutifully signed a prenup agreement, and we moved into a home overlooking Latta Park. It was a little awkward at first because, well, people had all these expectations about who I was, what my political views were, what my personal values looked like, even about the work that I would do and the way I would entertain. But we settled in. And then 5 years later, when we divorced, I had to come to terms with what having money did and didn't mean in my life when I could no longer afford to live in the neighborhood where we had lived. I was wallowing a bit in my newly humble circumstances and having a little bit of a pity party. And then a conversation I had with my then 91-year-old grandmother helped set me straight. It had taken me a few months to get it together to call her, not because I thought she would disapprove, but because I knew her secret. I was one of the few grandchildren at the time who knew that she had left my grandfather a year after she was married at the age of 17. It was the middle of the Great Depression, and she went home. Her father sent her back. She had no choice. So she did what many of the women did of her generation. She went on to have 3 children and just made do the best she could for the next 35 years until she was widowed. So when I called to let her know that my husband would not be joining us for Thanksgiving and to share that I believed our marriage was over, I could hear her voice crack. and I knew she was crying. She said, "I'm just so glad it's different for you, honey, that you can leave. You have a good education, a good job, and you've owned your own home." And there was silence. And then I could hear a smile creep into her voice as she said, "All you need now, dear, is a good handyman." But I had to remember what I had learned from the donors, is that giving is a way of healing these wounds of wealth, wounds of grief, any of the traumas that we've experienced as children or as adults. And so I went about looking for opportunities to support new beginnings for women who couldn't afford to leave, but did anyway. So today, two of my favorite charities are the YWCA, because of their work with women in transition, and Safe Alliance, because of their work with battered women. It's not just the meaning of money, but it's the stories we make up about the meaning of money that can keep us from finding our true calling, discovering a sense of meaning and purpose, and living a meaningful life. Today, the gap between the rich and poor in the United States is the widest of any industrial nation. And yet I believe that if we recognize that we all share these wounds of wealth, we're all suffering in ways, and if we can collectively focus our giving in ways that support our own values and vision for making a difference in the world, we can heal the world. What do the wounds of wealth look like in your family? If you were to make a gift today to heal that wound of wealth, what would it look like? For some of you, money is a surrogate for love. In other families, money is the rudder of the ship. But money can also be a tool and a platform for making a difference, and that's what I hope you'll do.